Welcome to our panel conversation on philanthropy and COVID-19, the urgency of promoting diversity, equity, and inclusion from the inside out. So earlier today, Senator Ratna Umidvar challenged us to remain part of the status quo or part of the disruption. Right before this session, we were privileged to have Hawa Mire lead a workshop on anti-Black racism, which was a deep conversation that challenged really all of us to rethink how to understand and how to use our position of power and privilege. Now the session will discuss the ways philanthropy can and should do better to respond to anti-racist movements and adopt an equity lens in its grant making and governance. So let me first introduce you to our moderator. Adjoa K. Bwane has a rich experience in both for-profit and nonprofit contexts. She currently serves as the CEO of Triac and is a PFC board member. So welcome, Adjoa, and over to you.
Thanks, Inez. And good afternoon, everyone. And thank you, panelists, for joining us here today. As Inez mentioned, I wear two hats and have some relativity to this topic as well, in the sense that I am the CEO of the Toronto Region Immigrant Employment Council, where we seek to find solutions and to better integrate immigrant professionals into the GTA, particularly our regional focus is the Greater Toronto Area labor market, as well as being a PFC board director. And so I at times may also add some commentary from those two lenses. What we'll do today is we're hoping to keep this conversational amongst the panelists. We certainly encourage you throughout the session to post in the chat questions, and Inez has offered to help monitor those questions. So at any point in time, we'll draw you into the conversation. You're also able to come on live if you'd like to ask a question via voice. What an odd concept. You're also able to do that. And we have a couple of set questions. But really, this is a conversation that we all need to have together. And so it's not for us here to sit and lecture and pontificate, but really to have a conversation with each other rather than to each other. So I'm going to ask each of my panelists to do a brief introduction of themselves and maybe make a couple of opening remarks, and then we'll get into the conversation. And I'd like to ask Sadia, if you wouldn't mind taking the lead on introducing yourself.
I'm Sadia. I'm the CEO of the In Spirit Foundation. The foundation funds media and arts for social change and is very concerned about narrative power. So really our work is systemic. We're interested in changing the systems and the pathways that inhibit underrepresented voices from really having some sense of narrative power within our all sorts of landscapes. We know that narrative power can shift policy and can change the world.
Thank you. Peter, may I ask you to introduce yourself?
Thank you. Yes, bonjour tout le monde. Mon nom est Peter Flegel, the Executive Director of the Federal Anti-Racism Secretariat, which is a brand new directorate within the federal government focused on leading a whole of government approach to combating systemic racism, discrimination, and hate across Canada, working with several departments and different sectors of society to bring about a fully inclusive, diverse, and equitable society for everyone.
Thank you. And last but never least, Rachel.
Yes, I'm very happy to be with you today on this panel. I just wanted to say a little bit about my journey. I have a bachelor in women's studies from the Simone de Beauvoir Institute at Concordia University. I have a master's degree in social work, and it's through that master's, through my thesis, that I explored the intersectional approach, and my thesis was on this approach when intervening with immigrant or refugee women from Western Africa that are pregnant and have HIV. So that's when I was awakened to the layer of different identities to form who we are. So for the past 12 years, I've been a social worker and a diversity, equity, and inclusion advocate. I made a change of career in the past few years, and upon getting into a new environment from social work, where it's about 95% of women and diversity is where there is diversity. I found myself in the tech industry where I was pretty much always the only one. So to decrease my isolation and to increase inclusivity into the tech sector, I've created 3 not-for-profit organizations to increase our representation within the tech industry, but also I co-founded an organization to empower tech organizers to have their event more inclusive for women and also to achieve parity within their panelists. Upon doing all these different things, I was mentioned earlier. I was granted, or I received a medal by the National Assembly of Quebec for the work that I've done, and I've been nominated in different diversity initiatives, such as in the Montreal Startup Community Award. That's really working really hard at diversifying and having more diversity within their rank. So that's pretty much a little my journey so far.
Well, and an impressive journey it is. And so I think what's interesting about your journey is it's really grassroots. It's really from the bottom up. It's creating change from within. And so perhaps the first question is really, aptly suited for you. So when you think about allyship, what are the misconceptions about allyship? What are the pain points, and how does one actually be a good ally?
Yeah, that's a really good question, Adwa. I have to admit, throughout my process, throughout my journey, allies were strong. They were crucial to building inclusive cultures in any organization that I was in or any organization that I created. So, for example, when you're looking to anti-racist ally, it's really someone, and that was my experience, someone who believes that anti-racist is important, but they really worked and they show me how they work to recognize and eliminate anti-racist biases. But first and foremost, the one that they might hold, which was for me impactful, because they would start from them. And one thing I think it's important to say about allies and allyship, it's really it's grounded into a set of interpersonal practices. So if we get into the behavior, my experience and what I've seen, an ally is someone who listens actively with the intention to learn and to better understand others' reality. I mean, at the bottom, where we have all our experiences are not the same, they're completely different. So I myself found myself in that position. But when you're listening to someone about their experience, and for example, what it is to be Black in Canada or actually anywhere else in the world, and you have those thoughts about, well, that hasn't been my experience, or I don't really agree with this, that is the point of seeking to better understand. I mean, it's those blind spots, like this opportunity to gain knowledge into what you don't know. And ally are aware of these blind spots that they fill with knowledge to better understand others' experiences. So mainly allies really seek to listen with the intention of learning. And I said education, like an ally will educate himself or herself, because it's not the responsibility of non-white to educate people. So at the bottom, we know that our attitude, behavior, and system needs to change. And yet ally identity is not formed by just listening to 2 hours of training on unconscious bias or anti-racist approach. It's through readings of anti-sexist, anti-racist, anti-ableist, anti-heterosexist authors. And eventually, from all that knowledge and that learning, you get at the core of inequity, and eventually reflect on how our behaviors, attitudes, and system need to change to eliminate any other oppressive practices.
Right. So Peter and Sadia, I mean, let's build on that. So Rachel is telling us, behaviorally active listening, and I mean that's that's a good behavior to have in all aspects of life, including in one's friendships and relationships. So active listening is really, but active listening with the responsibility of learning. And then the other piece that I like that Rachel said, you know, is educate yourself. And so taking also the accountability, not giving that onus on somebody else to educate, right? But taking it on oneself and say, I'm going to educate myself on this by doing the reading, by, you know, listening to the podcast, whatever form media one wants. Can you comment a little bit further on other behaviors or build on those behaviors? What else does allyship mean?
So thank you. So perhaps I could take this. So definitely it's that being a close and open listener, but also in playing that role of a listener, coming to that space with a particular frame or lens. So that's understanding that in a society one occupies a particular space in that society, and one which is structured by privilege. And that with that privilege, that means that there are people who are underprivileged, who have unequal access to resources. And secondly, I'm recognizing that that privilege is a symptom of unequal power relationships. And so the society that we live in, and in fact, the world that we live in, is structured, unfortunately, by asymmetric power relationships, which undermine the lives of certain while benefiting the lives of others. And so it's critical that in coming into that space of listening, that one is already conscious and aware of that privileged space and the power dynamics that really structure our society. And the second piece, which is also really important and really reflects the work of the Federal Anti-Racism Secretariat, is this notion of open, free, safe, and brave space. And so this understanding that if one is an ally, one needs to be around to enable, where possible, these types of spaces where those communities and those individuals who are directly affected, in this case, by racism and interrelated or intersecting forms of oppression, are able to speak out about the conditions that they're facing, are able to identify the systemic barriers that they face, are able to identify and propose effective recommendations and solutions, and know that those recommendations and solutions will be transformed into meaningful and effective policy, programs, services, and case of government legislation. So it's really a series or a suite of not only of dispositions, but also of a key kind of intellectual conceptual framework that one brings to the table as an ally.
And I think we're all, and then Sadia, I'm going to turn it over to you. We're all allies in one way or another, right? So I think about myself, I'm going to use myself as a guinea pig here throughout this session. I think about myself, Peter. I mean, there's forms of privilege that I possess, right? There are in some circumstances and some spheres where, of course, I face the racism and I face the discrimination, but there are other spheres where I actually am also part of that privilege. And so it's also recognizing that you can have both roles in this journey as well. Would you agree?
Is that for me?
Well, I did say, Peter, would you agree? And then I'm going to stop talking and let Sadia comment. So would you agree, Peter, that there is also privilege? I mean, we all, depending on the sphere we're in, we may be part of the privilege.
Definitely, depending on the position that one occupies, but one does have to recognize that when one is racialized, when one is a religious minority, when one is indigenous, automatically, it doesn't matter if, in certain circumstances, it doesn't really matter whether or not you're working class or a physician when it comes to, for example, encountering the police. All they see is, in my case, a Black person. And so, sure. Yes, privilege is ubiquitous, but so is inequality too.
Sadia, please.
Yeah, sure. On the whole notion about allyship, I guess the thing that always comes first and foremost to me is that in my career and certainly in my work, allies have come from the most unexpected places, in the most extraordinary ways. And to me, a lot of the allyship piece is actually quiet. It's a quiet voice that speaks when you can't speak. It's a quiet voice that pushes when you are not able to push because you don't have the systemic knowledge, or you don't have the levers of power or the ability to affect the levers of power. And it's not always someone that you even know is an ally, but who are very quietly just doing the pushing for you. And so I think about that a lot as well as allyship, because I know certainly allies have come from the most unexpected places.
That's interesting, and I think that relates to, and perhaps that not always is it overt, and the suite, or as Peter called it, the suite of characteristic or dispositions, that creating that open, free and brave space. Can we do that? Does anybody have an example of a time that you felt it was created for you, or you helped to create it?
Adwa, can you just repeat what you just said, because you cut for like a split second?
Well, maybe that was to my benefit, because maybe it wasn't a very good question. So what I said is, when we were talking about creating the open, free, and brave space that Peter was talking about, is, maybe can we explore a little bit more about how does one do that? Because I think a lot of people on this call are wondering, I believe in that, I want to do it, but how do I do that? Any one of you, jump on in.
I would say that the notion of safe spaces is a really, really tough one, because what is triggering for one individual or one person in a certain geographic location or other kind of socioeconomic situations is very different from what that might mean for somebody else. I love the notion of respectful spaces, where regardless of where we're coming from, we can have a respectful conversation, and often across difference. And I think that's where, where it gets, that's where the real work happens, is across some of those spaces, and the respectful piece.
And thank you. Rachel, Peter?
Yes, my experience of allies in the organization that I led, it always touched me how, I guess for them, the one that I've come across were very mature into their journey, because it was their grace to recognize their role as standing with me and not standing for or on my behalf. And that really opened myself, because as leading some movements, as being part of a leadership team where people look out to me, having someone who tells me what to do, and somebody non-Black or somebody straight up white, it was there's that grace that I found that some of the allies that surrounded me knew how to approach it, knew how to be present, knew how to sometimes even knew more about different experiences than I did. And it was everything was in the savoir-faire, being able to position oneself in a very graceful way. So I think there's it's not easy not to overstep your balance as an ally, but with understanding of inequity, I think there's it's a great journey.
Thank you. And if I could to add on that, so there's an expression or a saying that says nothing for us without us. And so this is, so to answer your question about how to for those who represent foundations who are listening in, how to create those spaces. The key there is to really allow communities and themselves, and we're talking racialized, indigenous, religious minority themselves, communities themselves, to define and shape what those spaces are going to be. Because communities who have for centuries experienced the racial discrimination, other forms of discrimination, know best how to react, how to respond, and what kind of healing opportunities are required to break bread and be effective in addressing some of the key issues that our society is facing. So it's really it's not a matter of giving a voice, because communities already have a voice. It's enabling the voices to be respected and to be heard even more, and to allow themselves to organize effectively.
Yeah, I think that's great. I mean, I think that's a really, these are really helpful tips, and that I'm hoping that certainly the participants on the call are appreciating as well, because I think, some of the questions I'm asking are probably questions, hopefully, that the participants might have, where the intent is there, right? The commitment is there, but sometimes, how do I do this? And so by saying, invite that community to create that space, already makes it a more of a collaborative and a part of that healing journey. So speaking of journeys, Rachel, I'm going to pick up on this word, and I'm going to give you sort of my characterization, and you can comment on it, to what degree I'm right, wrong, or probably shouldn't be moderating this conference. So I do see this, we use, especially in EDI work, we use the word journey. And I was saying to my colleagues the other day, I think what, a lot of organizations and leaders need to understand is, it sounds like a very social work kind of word, but it truly is a journey. And I said, for those of you who are more athletically oriented, which I'm not really a runner, but I said it is a marathon, right? That old cliche, it's a marathon, it's not a sprint. And I said, in order to run a marathon, I mean, the best I got to was, 15 clicks. So I can't imagine doing 42. But in order to do that, you first have to make that commitment. Right? I know friends have done it. They said, I'm going to run that Boston Marathon, or I'm going to run the Toronto Waterfront Marathon. And they say, that's it. 6 months from now, I'm going to run that marathon. So you have to have the commitment. Then you have to create a training plan. Like, you don't just go from not running much to 42 kilometers. And it's a lot of hard work. It's a lot of hard work. And it's a lot of Saturdays where, people are running 5 hours a day, heaven forbid. So you have to do your long runs, and you have to do your sprints and your hills. And there's a whole plan to get there. And then that's all before even race day comes, right? And then on race day, there's a whole bunch of other considerations before you actually finish and get across the line. So I really do think also for, whether it is foundations, whether it is organizations, individuals, the recognition that this is not something that happens overnight, and it's not a checkbox exercise. Please comment away.
You're talking about the journey of being able to have a strategy in diversity, equity, and inclusion.
That's the direction, yeah.
Yeah, that's going to be a conversation, and definitely not. This is going to be. I think we're going to be surfing the wave of that. You know what? I'm going to start it with this quote that I love from Neil Lennon. So, if you do not intentionally include, you will unintentionally exclude. So I'm starting with that in everything that I do. I always start with myself and my reality and my experience. And I took advantage of the fact that I was founder or co-founder or part of an executive leadership to lead by example. So for me, as a leader, it was always clear the vision that I have of inclusivity. So I was always conveying the message of inclusivity and belonging. And to your question, what does that look like? So I instill diversity, equity, and inclusion on 4 pillars of anything that I was, any organization that I was starting. In the identity, which means in the mission, I was lucky enough that all my organization was about, put into the light underrepresented community, or put into the light the underrepresentation of some communities. So I was coming, that was my starting point, and that was always about my mission, my value, and take a stand for social issues, because that was my purpose. That was the reason why I was doing those initiatives. But the other pillar that I had was about impact-centric work. So every time that we were doing any kind of initiative, we had to measure it. We had to make sense of our existence. And I know this is conceptual, but I'll give you some example. And the other thing is that we wanted to make it sustainable. Like the change that we were creating, it was woven into the fabric of our organization, which is the processes, the culture, and the practices. So in practice, what does that mean? It means as simple as call out inappropriate and exclusionary behaviors, especially when they happen in informal settings and informal interaction, I mean. And so it was addressed for me, it was addressed very quickly, respectfully, one-on-one. And then I took this opportunity to do collective learning, to bring my team into analyzing a situation without confronting the person. So That being said, I always had specific outcomes that I connected tightly with measurement, meaning that in the leadership team, we always try to go above 50% of representation of visible minority, of gender nonconformity as well. And to attract, to have participants that are interested in what we were doing, we needed to have a leadership that was showing that. So that's just one or two of the example that I can give where, you know, it has to transcend to everything that you're doing. And there's no, for myself, I was pretty radical. It's like it was not even negotiable, but it can be a challenge.
And it doesn't happen, I mean, and it doesn't happen overnight. And so you're talking about the measurement, and I think we heard the senator, right, say that this morning quite clearly as well. And as we're thinking about, you know, she was talking about the charitable sector, like, let's start with measurement. Let's fill out the StatCan survey and the surveys that are coming out, understand what you know, evidence-based decision-making versus sort of, I think this is what's happening. So Peter and Sadia, please, you know, continue the conversation on the notion of the journey or really sustainable actions.
Right. So thank you. So I like this, the journey analogy, or the metaphor rather, because so we've talked about more of the external, a bit of an external journey, but there's also the journey within. That's part of a key of allyship. And so looking at internally in terms of our structures, organizational culture, institutional practices to identify what the systemic racial barriers are, what are the unconscious biases that exist. At the federal level, so we're talking about examples. So the federal level, we launched Canada's anti-racism strategy, which is a 3-year strategy, which was actually built by centering the voices of racialized communities, Indigenous peoples, and religious minorities to see what was needed in terms of a federal or a national anti-racism strategy. And out of that is the strategy with 3 pillars. And the first pillar, this is really with regards to the journey within, it's demonstrating federal leadership. And so this idea that for the federal government to be active in the area of anti-racism, it needs to lead by example and, excuse the words or the expression, clean up its backyard. So that right there's an acknowledgement that within federal institutions, systemic racism is a reality and that more steps need to be taken. And so that is that critical work of not only looking internally, but also doing so with communities themselves, centering their voices to really assist and ensure that the work is that internal journey is done in a meaningful, effective, and appropriate way, recognizing that it's a journey, and so you definitely won't get it right the first time. It's going to take much more effort. It's going to take strategy, tactics, and indicators and monitoring to succeed.
Right, and so Peter is also addressing one of the questions, you know, that was given, what diversity, equity, and inclusion means to the federal government, right, as part of the Secretariat. And Sadia, I think it would be great. I mean, I spent some time on the your organization's website, and I think this is just, I mean, this is fundamental, really, to your organization. So maybe you can talk a little bit about the organization and how this translates into the work, because you're doing it for stakeholder groups externally, but how does it also translate internally into your operations?
Well, this is a really, really good question. And I think generally when we're having conversations like this, and there are a lot of these conversations going on at this particular moment in time, and that's a very good thing. What is easy is kind of the broad conceptual piece. Everybody agrees that this is important, right? Like nobody's going to say this is not important, this is a terrible thing to do. That's the easy conversation to have. And I think that we've also gotten to the point where we can look at that as beyond representation. So we're not just talking about diversity alone, right? That the representation piece is a bit of a, to me, is always a bit of a red herring, because it doesn't often lead to systemic change. Where it gets really, really tricky, and here I'll certainly talk about InSpirit. You know, from an organizational perspective, the biggest challenge was actually a shared definition of equity. Everybody agreed that it was really, really important, but what everybody thought equity was varied dramatically. And that was a really big learning for the organization. We had to come up with a shared definition of what that actually was. And what you see on the website is that shared definition. And we put it out there very, very publicly. But that was a process that involved the board, it involved the staff, it involved external folks in terms of getting to the place where we could actually agree this is what equity looked like for the organization. Because I think without actually being very mindful of having a shared definition, what we had were folks, having their own internal definitions. And if your definition didn't meet my definition, then, then we're going down different paths. And so that was very practically the first step. The next step was really a clarity on how that particular definition of equity aligns and expresses itself within the mission and the mandate of the organization. We can talk about equity generally in society, and that's a good conversation to have, but when it comes down to the day-to-day work, what does that actually look like within the context of our mission? And that was that was a very, very mindful, methodical, and very time-consuming process. And where we came to was really within our mission of social change through media and the arts is really this notion of narrative power. Who has it? Who doesn't? How do we change the balance? And to what extent can that even happen without our work being systemic? And that it is really about systems change, and it's about equity pathways into kind of those narrative spaces, regardless of what platform they're on. And then this was all further complicated by the fact that our ultimate goal, one of the reasons the foundation exists actually, is to foster pluralism. So when we think about pluralism as kind of the very far in the sky North Star that we're ultimately aiming for, we had to come to the understanding that along a spectrum, some communities do not exist at all in our public consciousness. They have no narrative voice, they have no narrative power, or when they exist, many of us exist as one-dimensional whatever, and not within the complexity and the diversity of our many, many different communities. And other folks are further along that spectrum and are in a place where they're able to lean in and have conversations across difference. Because pluralism for the foundation is actually also an active engagement with difference. And so we're holding all of these competing ideas in our brain at the same time and moving the work forward. And I think we could only do that until we came to some very, very, very time-consuming conversations around some of the foundational definitions of our work.
Yeah, I think, the question of equity, I want us maybe to stick on that for a little bit, because I think I appreciate what you're saying also, Sadia, that diversity, representation can be done, sort of check, right? But then what does it really mean? And I know even in our organization that if you were probably to ask every single colleague, to your point, what does equity mean? There would be variances in the definition. So how do we, so you said there's lots of conversations. I'm sure there's sometimes uncomfortable conversations. So how do you, and Peter and Rachel as well, when you've had these conversations, how do you actually get to that point where you say, okay, now we're comfortable? Or are there people who are still saying, I still buy it, and then the majority does? Like, how do you get there?
Okay, so what actually to answer your question, I'd go back and address the issue of diversity and inclusion and equity. For us at the Federal Anti-Racism Secretariat, diversity, is a description of it, is descriptive. So you have different people representing different backgrounds, and so that's it. And the inclusion piece is trying to make sure that people feel comfortable that are included, and the equity piece is trying to ensure that people are treated fairly, whatever that means. But there's another piece which is missing, and that's why we're called the Anti-Racism Secretariat and not the Diversity and Inclusion Secretariat, is looking at what John Rawls calls the background culture, so understanding that our society is structured in a particular way for a particular reason. There is a history behind it. There's, in this case, a colonialism, white supremacy, slavery, which has really lasted for many years on the land that we call Canada, and still infiltrates, unfortunately, some of our practices, some of our institutions, and perhaps even some of our laws. And there's a saying that some people will say that our society was never built for us. So whether or not we agree with that, that is a reality, a real perception out there, and which is based also on a real history and the fact that systemic racism still exists to this day. So that's why anti-racism is so essential, at least from our vantage point, because it really forces us to focus on those structural barriers, understanding where they're coming from, how they manifest themselves, and also what is necessary to remove them, to understand what the gaps are, and ensure that the voices and needs and realities and perspectives of racialized communities, Indigenous peoples, and religious minorities are adequately and effectively addressed.
So Peter, yeah, so you've taken, the Secretariat has taken the framework of colonialism, right, as the backdrop, and white privilege and lots of as a backdrop, on the foundation of which then you create those definitions of, for example, equity. So I want to come back to, if I'm understanding this correctly, because I do want to come back to this notion of equity. So therefore you're saying that if we're saying that equity is treating everybody fairly, it is against the backdrop of understanding the as you said, the John Rawls backdrop. Is that correct?
That's correct, and that's why another step is necessary to really look at the background culture as manifested through those practices, through the institutions, through some of the laws that unfortunately are not, for some, treat some better than others, even though they're designed in a way to be equal for everyone. And so that's why, as I said, having that focus both on equity but also anti-racism is so essential.
It's essential. And I mean, you know, again, I refer back to the senator's discussion today. I mean, she was referring to that as well, right? Some of the laws and legislation we have in the charitable sector go back to Victorian era colonialism, to this notion of, you know, handing out to the poor, but not alleviating poverty, right? I thought that was really interesting. Like I learned a lot from that session as well, that you could relieve poverty, but you weren't, you know, allowed to alleviate or reduce or eliminate poverty, is I think the word. Sadia, coming back to the equity then, can you help us understand in your organization, because you were kind enough to really describe quite transparently that it did take a lot of conversation and a lot of time. How did you resolve? Did you have a backdrop against which, as the Secretariat does, do you have a backdrop against which you made those definitions, or how did you arrive at those definitions?
Well, I guess on some level, I mean, I'm really, this is a really, really good point that Peter raises, the anti-racism piece. But without anti-racism, there can be no equity, right? That's certainly my kind of, that's a direct line for me. Without that piece of it being present, like us actively fighting anti-racism, I don't know how you get to equitable access and equitable opportunity to have the ability to access social, economic, all sorts of kind of spaces that allow you to succeed, right? That should give you the same opportunity as anybody else to succeed in Canada, in the society that we have today. And we know what the barriers are. All of us work very, very, very closely in spaces where we're very aware of the barriers. And I think coming to a shared definition, how did we come to those definitions? We came to those definitions through a lot of research, through a lot of conversations around board and staff lived experience, through a lot of, it was a combination of research, lived experience, you know, guidance from people who had been in this space forever. Because I think where it was really, really important to also set, because of our ultimate mission also around pluralism, it becomes more complicated, because we'd also define that pluralism as that ability to lead across difference. And I know that there are many days that I don't want to necessarily reach across difference when we're talking about this space. We're just trying to protect our own psychic space from a constant onslaught of whatever, right? And so those are very difficult concepts to hold in your head at the same time. And I would say that there is no easy answer to that question.
There's no easy answer, and I would suggest also there's no such thing as perfection within it, right? I think every one of us will stumble at some point in time, whether you're, the CEO of a foundation that's firmly rooted in the work, that everybody stumbles along the way. And so I haven't noticed any questions. Inez, I know you will stop me or text me if there's questions that come up. I really am going to pause for a moment before I think we'll talk about grant making, and Sadia, I'll come back to you as a foundation head about governance and grant making and in the charitable sector. Let's focus in on that. But colleagues who are on the phone, please do ask your questions. You're welcome to come, as Inez said, live and ask it out loud. If you're having a bad hair day, you don't have to turn your camera on. You can just unmute yourself. And we welcome any questions you might have for our panelists.
I do have a question here that was sent to me.
Nice.
Yes. So I have a question for the panelists. I'm wondering if any or all of them have one thing a small family foundation should do now to start on the DEI journey. Would you like
Great
me to?
question.
One thing, I'm wondering if all or any of them have one thing to say about a small family foundation, what they should do now to start on the DEI journey.
I would say the first step is to surround yourself with people who don't look like you, who don't come from the same socioeconomic background, and who may not even come from the same geographic background as you. Surround yourself with difference.
And I think that's aligns, and Sadia, I think you were on the call this morning as well when the senator spoke, right, about foundations and said to, the first step is just open up sort of the membership, or who look around and see who's on the board. And if it is a family foundation, open up that quote unquote membership, and or to your point, surround yourself with difference. Peter, Rachel, thoughts?
So I would just add, be prepared to have uncomfortable conversations. And that's a good thing. It's important, as I think the senator mentioned, the disrupting force, to be prepared to be disrupted, but seeing disruption as a transformational pathway to change and to becoming more effective.
I would add, I totally agree with what Peter just said. I would add to the discomfort. There's an opportunity to explore what was done in the past, because I'm not fully familiar with these kind of foundations, but I would say that within what was done in the past, whether in practices or in values and processes, re-explore these to see how they can be, how they were done and how they can be done differently. If you had the opportunity, how can DEI can transcend within every your values, your policies, how you welcome or how you give those sponsorship or grant.
So we're going to come back to the grant making and the sponsorship in a moment. I love it, the fact that somebody has posted something, and I'm assuming that's from the audience, right? This is not something we've internally posted yet, where somebody said, I've been thinking, sorry, I see you nodding, go ahead. Okay, and excuse me for squinting, it's bad eyesight, I'm getting old. I've been trying to think through the matter of anti-racism versus DEI. And I'm seeing it as a continuum, or perhaps a set of complementary platforms or objectives. Anti-racism is fighting racism, especially in its systemic form, is absolutely needed in order to get anywhere. But celebrating diversity, encouraging equity, and implementing inclusion are positive, action-oriented approaches that give us something to directly work on in a positive and constructive way. What do you think of this idea, panelists?
I guess I would think of diversity as a tactic, and it is of course it's a positive thing if it moves you closer toward a goal, which ideally would be around equity. So yes, lots of different tactics can get us to equity. Inclusion can get us to equity, but it alone will not work. Diversity alone will not work. It's a combination of all of those things that will get us, and anti-racism, right, being also a foundational piece of this, is all of those things required all the time and at the same time.
Yeah, so I think as the person who wrote this, it's complementary, right? But it's a suite, again, a package, versus any one of those activities being the answer. So really, Sadia, you're saying you have to kind of do all of it, right? Peter?
Yeah, so I would just add that, so anti-racism, I would encourage one to see anti-racism as also being constructive, as also being positive, because racism is essentially what is holding hundreds of thousands, if not millions of people back in Canada. And so that's why it's so fundamentally necessary to take positive, constructive, and tangible steps to remove those barriers, to remove the systems that are preventing people from achieving their full potential in our society. And that is a positive thing. It is fundamentally a positive thing. It has been transformational for many people, for many communities. If you look at histories of people of African descent in Canada, Indigenous peoples, it's been an opportunity to really reclaim, in the case of Indigenous peoples, their ancestral traditions, which were almost erased through the Indian residential schools. So the dichotomy, anti-racism negative versus celebrating diversity positive, perhaps I would challenge. There's an opportunity to challenge that and to see it through a different lens, and particularly listening directly to communities themselves who have been directly affected and continue to be affected by racism, and they might have a different perspective on that.
Yeah, I think that's fair, and it's about empowering potential, right? I mean, there's ways, as you're saying, we can perhaps reframe the perspective on it being a negative thing. Rachel, and then I have another comment. Rachel, did you want to add anything?
No, I'm good. I see someone who's
Yes.
showing in the camera, so I want to leave the space for the question.
So it was just me who asked the question. When I created the Peace Network for Social Harmony years ago, I specifically didn't want to be anti anything. I wanted to be pro solutions. And so that's where my thought process is. I completely see fighting racism as, beyond positive and beyond mandatory. It's super, super important. It's the basis to get anywhere. I'm looking for language that sort of gets us towards solutions, maybe, around education, around understanding, or around, I think ultimately equity and inclusion are where we're going towards. But again, I guess I'm just looking for, I tend to use more positive or not anti language. I guess that's how I'm trying to get around. I don't like using anti language.
Yeah, I think language is certainly very powerful, Brian. And I think that, many of us on the call would say though, sometimes we need that language in order to reclaim, right? So it is to empower and to reclaim the power that has been taken. So I think the language, it's also recognizing, I would suggest that what Peter and our colleagues would say on the phone is about what is the folks for whom you're becoming or want to be an ally, what would they say about it, right? So are they comfortable with the language? And so language can be very powerful, but sometimes also language is the power is in the reclaiming of something, and really saying, taking a stand with that word.
Yeah, and if I may add, I understand that anti may sound harsh, but it means against racism at the end of the day. We're at a point where we're really uncomfortable with a lot of words, but right now there's a lot of things that hasn't worked in a society that makes it that there's still injustice, discrimination, and there's still a big violence that's being done against multiple communities. So I understand that anti-racist can be confrontational, but sometimes it's these words that we need to be able to bring the attention to what needs to be discussed,
Mm-hmm.
So I would say go go boldly with these words and don't be afraid and show your colors by using these words that will stick in people's mind, and eventually through time they will understand how it's there's an opportunity to better understand equity.
I'm getting
If I may, so to add to that, so I think we're at an interesting time in our society. If we look at the public opinion polling over the last 3 or 4 months, we're seeing that over 60% of Canadians are wanting Canadian society, particularly the federal government, to be more active in combating racism. So there's this real prise de conscience and this opportunity, which I think was alluded to at the beginning of this session. It's a unique moment with the Black Lives Matter protests, with the awareness of the death of Joyce Echaquan in Quebec, and many other cases across Canada, but also internationally. And so there's a critical moment where actually being overt and speaking boldly, as was said, about combating racism, it was seen not only positively, but seen as a must by Canadians. So I would encourage, and Brian, we've known each other for a while now, I encourage you to try it. It's also a question of how you frame it and understand perhaps the underlying question here is how to position initiatives for potential donors. And so that's definitely a question. But again, given the context right now, there's a real appetite, and we're nationally. So it's an opportunity to seize that momentum.
Nice. So I'm going to shift us our track a little bit. We have about 15 minutes left, and certainly.
Can I just say, Adwa, thank you, Brian. Thank you, Brian, for your question.
Yes, absolutely.
It was a good question.
Yeah. Yeah, it's important that we have this discussion, right? And these discussions can sometimes also be a bit awkward at times, but that's all good. That's all part of the, the positive aspect of the commitment piece and being open to it. So I'm going to just switch us a little bit. Perhaps we're kind of along the, I think, still the same path. So somebody wrote, just to build on Sadia's point, would you agree that access to information also relies on privilege? How can social leaders, funders, grantors, equity-seeking organizations work on pluralism if there's a digital divide in the world? I would be curious to know your opinion specific to youth allies. And then there's the word thanks and a happy face. Sadia, over to you.
Oh yeah, this is huge. So we had the federal government announcement last week around some funding around the infrastructure piece. I mean, you can create all sorts of digital whatever, but if there is no infrastructure and no internet access, I don't know how you even begin to talk about equity. It's a systemic infrastructure issue, and if we don't, as a wealthy nation like this, get this under control, I don't, to me, it's just so foundational. And COVID has really also accentuated this. So absolutely, the access to infrastructure that allows us even to access this webinar, for example, or this conversation, is a basic human right that all of us in Canada should have. So that's that piece of it for sure. And then if you have and only if and when you have the infrastructure in place, then you can actually access the information. So I agree completely with the person who asked the question. I wish that we were further along on this journey. I wish that there had been even more money allocated by the federal government, because even the announcement last week is a start. But for anybody who's actually traveled or lived or lives up north, it's a big country, and there are lots of geographical challenges in accessing information.
So let's stay particularly in the charitable sector. The senator again this morning also said, building the capacity of the charitable sector through technology was something that COVID again has really emphasized, right? And so when we're thinking about the charitable sector, what is sort of advice or counsel would you give the folks on the phone who are grant makers, and whether it's from grant making perspective or it is from a governance perspective, again, external to the stakeholders, right, that they're serving, or internally within the organization? What advice would you give the charitable sector, the foundations that are on this call?
So one of the things that's definitely happened with COVID is we've had a lot of requests for shifting of programming to digital, right? For people are just trying to get through this period and trying to survive. And so that, and when the senator was speaking about that this morning, that's a reality, I think, for a lot of organizations, a lot of foundations, in terms of digital access, in terms of being able to pivot and move their offerings onto a digital platform that their communities can actually access. So just a basic building block for us in terms of our work. I'll talk a little bit about the grant making. And we're always asking, you know, from an equity lens, who's asking for this particular initiative and who's leading it? Is it community that's actually requesting it, or is it somebody else? And what is the reason? Whose voice doesn't have access to whatever this particular initiative might be? And where are the opportunities here to contribute to a narrative power shift in the context of our mission and our work? And what are the new pathways, new possible pathways to equity that might be possible because of a funding of X, Y, or Z? So we're always looking for things, you know, where possible to be led by within community, and where there's no infrastructure in community, we're looking for ally organizations that will actually let community have the primary voice, but who have the infrastructure and other pieces to support and guide whatever the projects are along. And then the whole question of impact, right? When we're in terms of grant making, like who decides what impact is? What does it look like in places where there are no infrastructure or no pathways? Impact looks very different depending on where you are, where you're situated. Our governance, just to answer the governance part of that question as well, we're very lucky. We have a board of directors that it's geographically, racially, ethnically, and from a gendered perspective, very, very diverse, also diverse in terms of age. And it's made for complex, nuance, and really, really rich conversations around equity and how it informs our work. And so I feel like we're very, very lucky that we have the board that we do, but that didn't happen by accident. You know, the boards before this one made, you know, and long before, I've only been there for 2 years in terms of my work at the foundation. Long before I arrived, somebody made, you know, very, very thoughtful decisions on what the board and the governance pieces should look like, and really activated and was very, very committed to kind of a board that reflects our country. We're very
Right. So sorry, I interrupted you.
I'd say we're in the minority in terms of the philanthropic space, though.
So very intentional, right? So again, I think for boards from a governance perspective, excuse me, the first thing is the intentionality of we are going to do this, and those conversations can, you know, I think also be uncomfortable. Why are we doing it? Should we do it? You know, it doesn't align to our history. It doesn't align to, you know, our families. So it's really it's becoming very intentional about it. I'm going to pause. I don't know if somebody has opened their camera because they were hoping to ask a question. So I just want to pause to make sure.
I do have a question. Is now a good time?
Now is a perfect time.
Okay. I was just wondering, in terms of this digital divide, is it incumbent upon funders to ensure that recipients are thinking about how they're ensuring equity in digital access? So should that be one of the lenses with which we address digital funding in sort of COVID response? Or do you think it's more about making sure the need is well established?
Really tough question, because I don't think that communities who have virtually no internet access have any control over the fact that they have no internet access. And so again, you're back to the first part of the systemic piece, right? Whose job is it to provide the infrastructure to make sure that people can even access the tools that they need to actually carry out their work? So you know, that's a complicated question. I mean, I personally, if you are organization XYZ and you're in, I don't know, Hay River or somewhere else where internet access is really, really spotty, you know, your ability to do your job should ideally not be hampered by the fact that the federal infrastructure to support the dissemination of your work doesn't exist.
So you know what, folks, I'm so sorry. Before you all start dropping off like flies, Inez just texted me and said we can go over by 5 minutes. I actually thought the session went till 4:45, so my bad. So panelists, you each have 30 seconds with a closing thought. If there are any other questions, please do email them to PFC. I'm sure the panelists would be more than happy to respond to any questions in the coming days, considering maybe now you're just getting rocking and rolling and we're about to cut you off. So Rachel, I'm going to start with you. Your 30 seconds, please.
Yeah, I'm gonna steal Peter's line. He said, "Have discomfort, uncomfortable conversation." Sorry about that. I'm gonna steal his line because it's great. You know, now is the time to be uncomfortable because it's actually in discomfort that beautiful things happen. So I will encourage that. Now is the time.
Peter, now you have to come up with a new good line.
Perhaps the new good line will be, well, first, thank you and congratulations for really putting on this timely conversation. And I think it needs to continue. And as the Federal Secretariat, we want you to know that we're interested in continuing not only conversing, but working with you and collaborating with you as we bring different sectors of society. So in the Federal Anti-Racism Secretariat, not only do you have an ally, but you have a friend. There's your line.
That's a heartwarming line right here, Peter. Got me right here. And last but not least, Sadia, please.
Yeah, I would only say that this is all messy. It's imperfect. It's a work in progress, and it will always be this way.
Whoa. On that note, Inez, Gian, is there anything else I need to say, or I thank everyone very much for joining. We are here for you to continue the conversation, and have a great rest of the afternoon.